Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Please take your seats. We have some free seats. Thank you so much. So I love dialogue. I love talking. This is a dialogue. You might not be able to actually hear your voices in the room, but there are going to be so many ways that you could be part of this Resilience Dialogue 5. So officially it's called Poverty Reduction in a Time of Extremes. My name is Femi Oke. I will be looking after you for the next 90 minutes or so. And let me tell you what we've got planned. Our co-hosts will give you an inspiring, an interesting, and intriguing introduction to the subject. And then we have a panel. The reason I said yes to doing this was they said, Femi, this is going to be provocative. You say provocative to a journalist? I'm here, right here with you. It's also going to be very candid. And I love this room because it's so intimate. You can actually look right into our panelists' eyes. You can tell if they're selling it a little bit, how honest they're being. So I'm looking forward to that as well. So here's a teaser, because that idea of poverty reduction and extremes and natural disasters and climate change, well, that sounds very theoretical. But back in 2010, 2011, Thailand experienced some very severe floods. There was a connection between those extreme floods and what happened to the GDP. I'm not going to spoil that story because we have the minister, the deputy minister of Thailand, who's going to be here and on the panel, and he will talk to you about that. But I'm really going to give you some really concrete examples about how important it is, what can be done, and the impact as well. So I did mention this was a dialogue. So many ways for you to be part of the conversation. We are live streaming right now. You can also tweet us as well using the hashtag resilience. You can tweet your friends and say, hey, I am live streaming right now. This is what you'll need to know. www.gfdr.org. Or you can just follow the feed for @GFDRR. And also, we could just do it old school. You've got paper on your seats. Write down the question. Give it to one of the staff or put your hand up, and then we can ask the panel as well. Incredibly interactive. So the only thing I have left to do now is to tell you to put your phones on silence, on vibrate, because I don't want you to be embarrassed by it going off during our conversation. And then I have to actually tell you that this conversation is brought to you by the European Union, the government of Japan. I'm going to only say this once. Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, or GFDRR for short, and the World Bank. So now we are ready to get started, and we will start with Sri Mulyani Indrawati. She's the World Bank's Chief Operating Officer and Managing Director. Sri, thank you.
Thank you, Femi. This is my second time in the same room since this morning, so I just want to make sure that I'm not going to confuse which one is this. But I'm sure I'm not, because this is a very, very important when I welcome you all here. It's really a pleasure to all guests and next to the panel on this, the 5th meeting of the Resilient Dialogue. As you know, every annual spring meeting of the bank, this has become one of the topics that is always come up, and it's always have a lot of strong traction from many of our client country, because it's really resonate well with many of the situations that they are facing back home. When we began the Dialogue of Resilience series back in 2011, and in this case, I would like to thank the leadership of the government of Japan, which is it is not only providing a lot of support, technical assistance, money, of course, but also their own experience of dealing with a lot of disaster, and then translate into how we can build a resilience. The European Commission, my friend, especially Commissioner Georgieva, who is here today with us, and also many other partners of the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, or GFDRR. Femi is very fluent in saying it, GFDRR. How we are going to link this, the discussion about resilience and disaster reduction and recovery, with the newly endorsed by our governors during the last annual meeting of 2 goals of the World Bank Group. As you know, President Jim Kim, in the last annual meeting, provided this, 2 new goals, where then tomorrow we'll present the new strategy to the government. The 2 goals is reducing poverty or eliminating poverty by 2030, 3% 2030, so 3 by 30s, and boosting shared prosperity, especially for the bottom 40%. So that goes definitely easy for all to accept and to adopt. The question is how you are going to strategize yourself and implement, and tomorrow President Kim is going to present the strategy in front of our governors. And while we are working for the poverty reduction and boosting shared prosperity, we do understand that constantly each country actually operating in a time of extreme weather, booming urbanization, unprecedented concentration of people and assets in vulnerable areas. And this is the climate change related disaster is going to be one of the biggest challenge for many, especially for the finance minister when they are gathering here, because it really affects a lot of financial sustainability. It costs a lot, not only in terms of money, but also in terms of the victim. So we recognize that we cannot achieve these 2 important goals without building resilience to disasters, which are made more frequent and intense by the climate change and with spiraling costs and consequences. Disasters are a threat, and especially for the poorest. I am, unfortunately, too familiar also with this devastating impact of disaster on countries' development effort. When I was finance minister, Indonesia was hit by tsunami. That is the biggest Aceh tsunami. In only one day, the 3/4 of the whole city was wiped out. It's devastating if you, not only on the number of the victims, but you can see really the humanitarian as well as all the destruction which is made by that. It is, of course, then call for many international community to support us, but that is one of the examples. Another 2 years from that, we also suffer from the Java, which is most populated. We then suffer from the earthquake. So you can see that the frequency of all this natural disaster cannot be treated just as a random that then become a shock for the policymaker. We have to build in within our policy how we can build the resilience within the economy, within the people life, and that is the challenge, and that's become really the development issue. Disasters have pervasive impact. Over the last 30 years, developing countries suffer an estimated $1.2 trillion in damage and losses from disasters. We know that this figure is underestimated since it does not include the cumulative impact of smaller recurring events which affect community. Women, today we are talking always about the gender. Women typically outnumber men among those dying from natural disasters. For example, they are less likely to learn to swim, and that's especially true in the Aceh tsunami situation. The dress code restricts their mobility in some cultures, or they are expected to stay behind when disasters strike to care for young, elderly, or sick household members. The death rate of women after the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami was at least 3 times higher than that of men in some communities. The good news is, however, that mortality rates in general have declined over the years. One life lost is still one too many. The trend is, of course, need to be nurtured, and this encouraging trend need to be strengthened. It means that investing in managing disaster and climate risk does pay off. And we are making the right decision when we make resilience a priority in our work and choose gender-informed approaches. But we have a lot more to do, and it is the poor and the vulnerable who bear the burden of disaster impact. They often live in fragile environments on the fringe of settlement. And that is the challenge for all of us, to build this resilience within the mainstream of top policy design. The poor, they don't have the safety net of saving, property, or insurance. Forced to sacrifice productive assets and saving for survival. The poor also face the very real threat of being locked into poverty, and those who leave poverty behind can be knocked back. So can we achieve our goal while millions of people are just one earthquake or one hurricane away from falling back into poverty? I certainly look forward for the discussion today, hearing for distinguished panel who they also been seen disaster in their professional or even in their life. I know of the country, Thailand is my neighbor. When I was in Indonesia, of course it is far neighbor from Washington now, but still a neighbor. Colombia is of course the one who also quite frequent in facing with this disaster and as a policy challenge for the policymaker in addressing it. And most importantly, of course, we are going to hear from the World Bank how we could support and help the country to address this disaster and to better prevent or reduce the impact. Our World Bank in this case is investing a lot of knowledge and experience, and we are happy to share with you. And now I'm going to mention special country, Japan. This is particularly true for the country of our next speaker. If there is one country that really understands what it means to manage natural hazard and thrive in the face of adversity, it is Japan. And thanks, in this case, not only that Japan have their experience and accumulate knowledge and the expertise, they also very generous in contributing from this Japanese government setting up a special $100 million program to mainstream disaster risk management in all of our World Bank development program through this GFDRR. As part of this special program, GFDRR will open a new hub in Tokyo, and this is aligned and consistent very well with the promise of the bank to become a solution bank. The new hub in Tokyo that will match Japanese expertise in disaster risk management to demand, which is now growing very fast from many our client partners as well as from partner countries. So I am honored to welcome to the podium Vice Minister of Finance of Japan, Furusawa-san. Furusawa, I think you can go.
Thank you, Mulyani, for the very kind words. Thank you, everyone. Welcome to the fifth Resilience Dialogue. I'd like to thank all the panelists and the participants for joining us today. And I want to express my deepest appreciation to the World Bank, the European Commission, who worked with Japan to host this event. The Resilience Dialogue was launched 2011 after the Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami. It served as a forum to discuss resilience against the natural disaster and mainstreaming disaster risk management into the global development agenda. In April this year, we explored how we could incorporate these issues into the post-2015 development framework. Today, we will focus on link between resilience and poverty reduction, which I believe contributes to the current discussion on the World Bank Group strategy and post-2015 development goals. At least 80 countries around the world, most of them poor, are considered seriously vulnerable to natural disasters. Disasters have historically hampered poverty reduction and economic growth. And as Mulyani mentioned, over the last 30 years, the developing world has suffered an estimated $1.2 trillion in damage and losses from disasters. And the impact has been felt most acutely by the poor. This is why Japan has repeatedly advocated that disaster risk management be an essential part of the overall development agenda. Over the past 2 decades, Japan and the World Bank have played a central role in providing disaster management assistance to developing countries. Assistance from Japan and the World Bank accounts for 60% of total investment in this field. Japan wants to continue to play an important role in close cooperation with the bank. With discussions on IDA 17 and GEF 6 replenishment currently taking place, we also hope that the disaster risk management will be incorporated into the future IDA and GEF projects. The financial resources is not only things needed to address disasters and spur development. Equally important is the technical assistance. We believe that Japan has a unique expertise and technology to share with developing countries based on their own experiences. For example, Japan collaborated with the World Bank to study the lessons learned from the Great East Japan earthquake. We identified 32 lessons that are useful in developing risk management strategies. For instance, we learned about the importance of understanding disaster risks. Governments and their citizens, including the poor, need to perceive disaster risks accurately. And they need to be aware of the limitation of the disaster response measures in place. For example, Japan underestimated the magnitude of the tsunami in 2011, which may have led to delays in evacuating residents. We also learned how communities play a critical role in preparing for and coping with disasters. Communities can help to prevent the spread of damage, maintain social order, and provide support to the vulnerable. Only through technical cooperation can such know-how be passed on to other countries and adapted to local circumstances. This is why Japan is committed to mobilizing its expertise to help developing countries become resilient. To make this happen, I announced here last April that we will launch the World Bank Hub for Disaster Risk Management in Tokyo. I hope that the organizational reform of the World Bank Group will not unduly delay the hub's creation, which was originally planned for this month. The Sunday statement last year emphasized the need to increase technical and financial assistance for disaster risk management. It recognized that disaster can undo the achievements of development instantly. Therefore, it is critical that we work together to enhance the resilience of developing countries in order to ensure sustained long-term growth. I hope that today's discussion will help us explore how to best integrate disaster risk management into developing policies and programs. I look forward to an active and productive dialogue. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Vice Minister Furusawa, and also to the Managing Director of the World Bank, Indrawati. Thank you very much, MD. So they won't be staying for the whole event, but don't draw attention to it, because that means that we can be incredibly candid and provocative once they've left the room. So the panel, I'm going to call them up to the stage. So we have on our panel today Minister Kerarat. He is the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance of Thailand. Please come up to the stage and find your name on the chair and be seated. Thank you very much. We also have Dr. Kristalina Georgieva. She is the European Commissioner for Humanitarian Aid. Thank you very much. And you will find your chair and the name, and we will mic you up as soon as we can. From Colombia, we have the Minister of Finance and Public Credit, Mauricio Cardenas. It's great to have you, Minister. Please find your chair. And finally, Rachel Kyte is the Vice President for Sustainable Development at the World Bank. She is responsible for the bank's work on climate action, resilience, agriculture, infrastructure, urban development, and social development. That's very long to put on her business card, but somehow she manages. So this is the part where I talk until the panelists are mic'd up. I'm really intrigued as to hear if there's anybody who've experienced or comes from a country where there is climate change or natural disasters, because I'm just intrigued as to what you're doing here. There's so many people here. Hello. Where are you from, sir?
Mexico.
Mexico, okay. The latest natural disaster for Mexico was what?
We have had everything.
Everything.
But floods was the latest.
Mostly floods, okay. So we're going to be listening out for floods. That's one of the first stories we're going to start from with Mexico. I'm making notes here because if you don't have questions for Mexico, I do. Okay, anybody else? Natural disasters, different countries where they experience natural disasters. So you're just intrigued and you're observers. I like that. Very nice. Okay, let me just remind you how you can take part in the dialogue. At GFDRR, you can follow that on Twitter and follow the live tweets to see what's going on. The hashtag you will need is #resilience. You can email your question to resilience.dialogue@gmail.com. That's pretty easy to remember. And also, we could just do it the old school way. Get a piece of paper, write your question down. People standing up, they're members of staff, I hope. If they're not, just bring the question up to me. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Let's get the conversation started. Remember I mentioned the Thai floods 2010, 2011. Deputy Prime Minister, I wonder if you can remind us what happened, how much warning you had, and then the impact on your GDP. So start the story at the floods. Did you know the floods were going to be that bad?
Well, let me start by giving some information about Thailand. Thailand is a country with GDP of about 400 billion US dollars, and the annual budget of about 20%, which is $80 billion, right? In 2011, after the very successful first 3 quarters of the year, we had all the reason to believe that we could achieve as high as 5% GDP growth, because after 3 quarters, we already have achieved more than 3/4 of that target. But with that flood came in the last quarter, it wiped out all the GDP we have already achieved in the first 3 quarters. So that's the degree of damage. And according to the expert team of World Bank, they have appraised the damage of assets of that flood. It was as high as about 1.4 trillion Thai baht, which is about half of the other budget. So it was very serious, and the Thai government, of course, has got to do everything we can. We have tried to regain confidence of those business people, international investors, to decide to stay on so that we can keep jobs for our people. And of course, we've got to set aside very immediately emergency budget of about 5% of the annual budget, which is about $4 billion US. And that's for only first couple months after the flood. But let me try to share you another story. There was a big flood, not as big as we suffered in 2011, but there was a big flood in 1995. Big enough that some organizations like our friends in Japan, we have JICA, Japan International Cooperation Agency, and also another organization in Thailand called the Royal Thai Crown Property Bureau, an office report directly to His Majesty the King to draft up the master plan and recommended the government then that we should invest enough to prevent the future flooding. Unfortunately, if some of you may recall, 1997, Asian economic crisis, where the center of the crisis was in Southeast Asia and in Thailand too. So the recommendation, the official recommendation came out in 1999. So it's about a year and a half after Asian economic crisis. So I didn't try to blame the administration of the country then by too much, because the crisis was so strong that the country went flat broke with international reserve, and then suffered severely that we had to float the Thai baht or local currency. When someone recommended the government to invest huge amount of money to prevent something that might or might not have happened, so it's very easy for the government then to decide to leave those two big files of the two organizations on the shelf with thick dust. But it's sad that the damage was as high as I mentioned to you, several times more of the amount that we should have invested to prevent it. So that's a story I would like to end here, and to see perhaps my friends from Mexico can join us. Thailand is actually a very lucky country that geographic-wise, we sit in the middle of the mainland of ASEAN. In the west, we have Myanmar. In the east, we have Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos. So the country is somewhat better protected with the storms and natural disaster. But these days, it's different. Heavy rainfall can provide too much water for the country, and we suffer, as I mentioned to you, in 2011. So that's for the first round.
I hate to actually say this out loud and vocalize it just in case it happens, but if 2011 happened again in Thailand, what would be different this time?
Well, as I mentioned to you that we had the master plan since 1999. So when I first found out that we have had those plans unimplemented, I was very sad, very upset. But after a few nights, I was well recovered to understand that having some plans unimplemented was better than having no plan. So those two plans were the groundwork for us to jump into it. So we invite our friends from JICA and also those experts from Crown Property Bureau to review the plan again. And we proposed to the Parliament requesting to invest as much as $11 billion to prevent this, because I don't believe that we would be given the second chances if we do not invest this time. Then how could we convince those people that Thailand already learned the lesson?
So
However, it's already 2 years after that, right?
Wow.
As of now, we have invested only up to about 10% of the plan. And the rest 90% is still in the process.
how nervous do you feel right now?
Very, very much nervous, And
why does that happen? Why do you have a devastating flood in 2011 that does the financial damage that you described, and you only have 10% investments?
Yeah.
I'm getting upset. I don't even live in Thailand.
No, don't. Well, actually, in those early weeks, early months, when I have to try to convince our friends not to leave Thailand, right? I felt then that I had to really explain a lot. But instead, they said, don't have to explain. They said, we wouldn't move from Thailand to somewhere else because at least you learn the lesson. If they move to some other countries that haven't learned the lessons, and His Excellency Furusawa used the term a while ago, underestimate. There might be still far too many countries that still underestimate the future. So Thailand got the warning once, then got the lesson once, and then it's time for us to invest. However, when I discussed with some panelists before jumping up here, and they asked me that what happened, I said, some legal interruption. And I'm sure that those who don't really know Thailand too well might feel that might be the problem of land reclaim, might be the problem of moving people from the new floodway that we plan to build. Yes, that's part of the problem too, but the real problem was actually more interesting, and I would really like you to learn about this. When we were very ready, we opened up for international bidding. We welcome all the experts from all over the world to help design and plan to build the system. Some NGO showed up, right? And then they raised the challenge to the administrative court and saying that this new concept of build design is still not very much proven. It's huge amount of money to be thrown into the system, and then not quite very well guaranteed that whether it will work or won't. And the EIA, HIA is still not too perfect. I, of course, was very upset because during those difficult days when I have got to do everything I could to hold hands of those more than 3 million people who suffer directly of that flood. Of course, Thailand is a country of 60 million population. I didn't see those NGOs around. And then, again, when I'm trying to invest into this, some NGOs showed up. And as of now, we seem to suffer a little bit of the challenge. Heavy rainfall is still there. Those who follow the situation, you might hear that in the east of Thailand, northeast of Thailand, together with Cambodia, which is in our eastern border, suffer with the heavy rainfall and the flood. So that's the situation in Thailand now. Of course, being the government, you can't really do everything, especially when the issue goes to the court. You've got to really respect the jurisdiction and the justice process. But of course, I'm trying to push this to get through the verdict to come out so that we will jump into it. So the commitment of the government is the first second that when the verdict come out, we'll go immediately into the investment.
So I want to make sure that I do not monopolize this conversation because we have Rachel Kyte here, we have Dr. Kristalina Georgieva, we also have Minister Cardenas as well. Your expertise is fantastic, so I will ask questions. You've got much smarter things in your head than I have coming out of my mouth, I assure you. So feel very comfortable about jumping in and adding to it. For instance, Rachel, when the Minister was talking, I saw you nodding. What was going on in your head as you were nodding?
Well, deep empathy. I think in the bank we have figures for a number of countries who've gone through the kind of disaster experience that Thailand has. From Indonesia to Mongolia and the droughts to Fiji and floods, and of course we're watching the state of Odisha on the eastern coast of India, which is right in the eye of a Category 5 cyclone over the next 24 hours. So unfortunately for us, the disaster risk and resilience business is a growth business. But I think what the figures don't tell you, I mean, we can talk about the percentage of GDP lost, is that the differential impact that disasters have on the most vulnerable and on the poor. So we know that the poor are remarkably resilient, actually, in the way in which they manage their finances and the way that they cope. But they are the least resilient in that their access to resources in the time of a disaster. We also know that the poor and the most vulnerable, because they have less access to resources, will be impacted not just in the immediate but in the long run. So even a minor disruption in nutrition will have a profound impact on the capability of a young child to learn and to do well. It will affect their health for many years to come. Being pulled out of school because you have to help with the family's finances as the family tries to re-establish itself post a disaster will have a huge impact on the income earning potential of that young person. So disasters not only throw everybody's GDP off, they set everybody back, they impact the poor most, and at an individual level they can profoundly alter the future of that young person. And I think that trying to understand that and make that our vision of how we are going to end poverty by 2030, how we are going to build that prosperity, and tell that human story of not just geophysical earthquakes, etc., but of the fact that the intensity and frequency of disasters is the story of climate change as well. I think that's we regard that as a profound responsibility as the World Bank would.
The first part of this conversation, I suspect, might depress you, because we're going to talk about disasters and the impact they have. The second part of the conversation hopefully will make you leave on a high note, because then we're going to talk about solutions. My friend from Mexico, when I asked him, well, what natural disasters have you seen? He said, everything. You should hear what the Minister for Colombia has had to deal with in most recent years. I think you might change your mind. So we've had 6 earthquakes in the last 3 decades, 4 volcanic eruptions, extensive flooding and landslides. That's all I had room to put on my card right here, Minister. How do you even begin to deal with that, or does it just deal with you? You don't deal with it?
Well, you read my mind. You read my mind. I actually, in preparing this panel, I said, well, let's take a look at the recent history of Colombia. But let me begin with a note on Thailand. When I was in school, I learned that if you drill a hole in Colombia, you get to Thailand. Then I went and I visited Thailand, and I saw with my own eyes how similar our countries are. Same vegetation, same fruits, same many similarities, geography, climate. Then I heard the minister, and same figures, $400 billion GDP, $80 billion budget. And again, another similarity. Extreme events, extreme events that affect us. So we're in the opposite sides of this planet, and we're dealing exactly with the same issue. So I was looking at the list just for the last 3 decades, slightly 3 decades. So we have a tsunami in the Pacific coast in 1979, cost the lives of about 700 people. An earthquake in 1983 in the city of Popayan. An eruption of a volcano in 1985 cost the life of nearly 30,000 people. An avalanche and floods and an earthquake in the southern part of Colombia in 1994. An earthquake in the city of Armenia in Colombia cost the life of nearly 1,200 people. And then the recent floods associated with La Niña in 2010 and 2011. Total damages, in this case I'm going to measure them in dollars, about $6 billion. So these are extreme events, but they're highly frequent, as you can see. I mean, there are lots of episodes in just 3 decades. So the question is, what do you learn from that, and how do you deal with it? And I guess, we in Colombia have adopted new mechanisms to cope with this. First, we have to understand that to a large extent, not all of them, but many of them, especially the recent ones, the La Niña phenomenon, are related to climate change. So we have to get very serious about climate change. And that's why Colombia is very much at the forefront of the debate, the global debate about climate change and the need to curb emissions. Let me give you an example of that. We are an oil-producing country. We produce 1 million barrels of oil per day. But despite that, and this is an exception rather than the rule, for producing countries, we tax heavily the consumption of fossil fuels, 25% tax. It's a higher tax than in the US. I mean, one of the things makes me very unpopular in my country is that gasoline prices and diesel prices are higher in Colombia than in the United States. And I don't want to make a comparison with our neighbors, because neighbors are also oil producers, but they heavily subsidize fossil fuels. So that makes my job very difficult. But this is very important to curb climate change. Second, we are working on the fiscal side of these extreme events. Extreme events can be devastating not just for the lives of people and their assets, but also they can put the fiscal accounts in really bad shape if you're not well prepared. So you have to have mechanisms that allow you to have, for example, access to contingent loans that you can withdraw from in a state of emergency. And this is what we have negotiated with the World Bank. We're one of the very few countries in the world. We just signed in 2012 a $250 million loan that is contingent on declaring a state of emergency. And most importantly, we have a fiscal rule. Our fiscal rule establishes a clear path in terms of the reduction of the fiscal deficit, the maximum deficit we can have year by year, and a reduction in public debt. Public debt in Colombia is about 30% of GDP. It's very low. But in the law that created the fiscal rule, there is an escape clause, which is essentially something that we can use in the case of a state of emergency, where we declare a state of emergency. Then to cope with that, we have more degrees of freedom, and we have access to the World Bank loans. So that's very important. And we, in the past floods of La Niña, we enacted a law that created a special government agency to assess and to cope with these extreme events. So we have permanent monitoring of this situation, and this agency in normal times is essentially making sure that the population is ready, that there is enough protection, that we have more resistant construction, infrastructure, that the population is aware of the risks, and they know what to do if an extreme event occurs. So that's an agency that is very important, and I would recommend every country to have that. That agency is for, and then if something occurs, the agency is the first line of defense. They come with food or water to deal with these situations. So anyway, just sharing a little bit some of our experiences with this. The World Bank has been very important with these CAT DDoS loans, which are, I think, something that my advice, other countries facing this type of situations and contingencies should think about doing.
So, Minister, that's a very extensive strategy. And if you're going to be very unpopular for having very high gas prices, we want to know, is it working? And how do you know?
You know, this is a global problem. So Colombia is doing its part. I mean, we're dealing with the costs of climate change. We're being part of the solution. But other countries have to do the same. Otherwise, it doesn't work. I mean,
are you confident right
climate
now?
change does not stop in the borders.
Sure.
Climate change is a global problem, so other countries have to stop subsidizing fossil fuels.
But that's a lot of pressure. So you said your neighbours don't do that.
Well,
so do you feel that you're like
don't
running
get
against
me
a brick
into trouble
wall?
with my neighbors. I have very good relationship with them.
We need to talk to your neighbours. So I just made a note that Dr. Kristalina made a note. So what's on your notepad?
Well, let me start by saying that, boy, it feels good to be European today. Not only for a first time, I'm for a third time on the discussion of this subject at the annual meetings. Not only for a first time, it is not the euro crisis that people talk about, but it is something else closer to this room. But I can say proudly we have the highest fossil fuel prices in the whole world. We are right there fighting climate change in Europe, despite 5 years of economic difficulties with determination. But actually what was going through my mind when I was listening to my neighbors is that we, of course, worry about more frequent disasters undermining growth prospects in middle-income countries, in wealthier countries, in Japan, in Europe, in the United States. But where climate change bites the most, it is in the poorest and most vulnerable countries, where it is not a problem of the future, it is a problem of yesterday and today. And not only these countries are most vulnerable, but they tend to be countries fragile. They, 2/3 to 3/4 of the poor countries that have frequent natural disasters are also conflict-affected countries. And the population growth in these countries tends to be the highest. So more and more people in very fragile environments facing the hammer of
Right.
climate change.
Dr. Kristalina, do you mind being more specific, talking
I'm
about
going to be very
countries?
specific. If you
Be
kind of
specific.
give me a second, this
Okay.
audience knows me. I kind of get to the point
All right.
eventually, sometimes faster, sometimes less. So here is an example that really shook me to my core. I was in Ethiopia, and we were visiting the Somali region. And there, in a small zone, Shinile zone, they had a unique set of data, 60 years worth of what happens to ownership of livestock and what happens to the composition of livestock. So what this data shows, Rachel, is that for 30 years before 74, the distribution of ownership of livestock, which is the wealth of people, was fairly equal between poor people, middle income, and rich people. In the next 30 years, from 74 on, it changed dramatically with the poor people wiped out, they have nothing, and the rich becoming richer. So if anybody needs evidence that climate change disproportionately affects the poor, here it is. On top of it, in the first 30 years, they had what? They had cows and goats and sheep and camels. But in the last decades, that composition also changed dramatically. Guess what they have now? Camels, goats, no more cattle, almost. It shrank dramatically because there is no grass to sustain the cattle. Now, I'm starting with this story to get to my main point, which is 80% of the victims of climate change, climate-related disasters, and other disasters come from the 20% most vulnerable people. We have that much chance to eradicate poverty in these areas unless we tackle the issue of resilience for the most vulnerable. And here is my provocation to this audience. But we are inclined still to opt for the traditional approach to development, which is a rising tide lifts up all boats. Whereas what is happening is not only people who have no boats don't see them being lifted, but we have a new factor that crushes, sinks the boats of these most vulnerable people. And I'm getting to where I see a huge agenda for all of us to take on, and it is to work on the evidence with governments in these most vulnerable countries, and I'm thinking of the Sahel and Horn of Africa, to make sure that we actually do focus our resilience building to the 20% most vulnerable people. Because if we don't do so, we will actually not achieve the objective of eradicating poverty. So let me stop at this.
We're getting
And get your
questions in.
question.
Yeah, we are getting questions in the audience. If you have questions, raise your hand as well. I've got some of them already. Do just make us aware so that we can get your questions to the panel. So this one's really relevant from what you were just talking about. So we heard about countries with well-functioning governments like Thailand, like Colombia. But what about fragile states which may be even more vulnerable, which is exactly what you were saying? What's the strategy there? Can there be a strategy?
Absolutely, and I think that the evidence is also building up that when we apply a coherent support to countries, when we work at 3 levels simultaneously, we work at community level, we help communities find and embrace the very simple and actually very often cheap measures to withstand these recurrent shocks, and do that so that lessons learned in one place can be translated to another. For example, we all know, I'm sure there are people here in the audience who are doing it. We all know that if you change the roof on a house so you can catch water, in these rare cases it comes, and then store it in a simple, cheap plastic container, you tremendously extend the capacity of people to withstand recurrent droughts. If you work with communities to anticipate drought coming and shrink the livestock so you have as much heads of goats and sheep and whatever it is and camels as the grass allows, you can withstand the shock. But this is not enough. Then you have to work at the level of governments. You have to have policies that help the most vulnerable people. Social safety nets. How many of you guys here work on social safety nets? Yeah? Wow, I thought there would be more. We know that social safety nets prevent children dying from malnutrition when they're properly designed. But the governments have to take responsibility for that. We know that if you have free access to health care for children under 5 and pregnant women, you help countries withstand. And then at the 3rd level is regional cooperation. Countries learning from each other, working together. We are funding now 1.5 billion euros for the countries of the Sahel region to help individual countries, but also help the region come together. But the most important lesson I learned in my work is staying power. This all would be for the birds or for the sheep or for the goat if it is not decades in implementation. And this is where we as international community tend to be not so good. We are great to jump on a topic when it is lifted up, but not so great to be there 20, 30, 40 years later. I was taught, I'm repeating this to everybody who wants to hear, but I was told by my own staff just a couple of days ago, they said, Commissioner, your success on resilience is not going to be what you achieve in these 5 years of your mandate. It would be what the successor of your successor achieves.
So Minister Kyte is nodding, Rachel is nodding. Rachel?
Yeah, I think that first of all, I completely agree that we have to be in for the long haul, right? I mean, first of all, you don't escape from fragility in the course of a 3 or a 5 year program. You escape from fragility over a generation. You don't see the gains from the investment in the short run. You see them over the long run, and we have to be able to be there as partners of choice as the World Bank Group over the long run, and we have to be able to take a 10, 15, 20 generational perspective on what we're doing. I also think that there are things that you can do with the community even in the teeth of fragility or lack of good governance, and I would add to the examples that Kristalina gave, examples of working with communities on the way in which you make sure that the built environment can withstand shocks. So, unfortunately, public buildings collapse far too quickly, with perilous results for school children, etc., where corruption and bad governance have just made sure that those are not built to code. But we know, working with communities, and I've seen this firsthand in Indonesia, I've seen it in Haiti, where working with communities you can, building by building, owned or rented, give people a chance to withstand the next shock. And so I think there's a lot to be done to explain, and this goes back to the Deputy Prime Minister's first point, the value of the investment in prevention versus the cost of in human life, but in economic terms, of always having to pay for relief. And the numbers are really quite daunting. And an ounce of prevention is really worth $4 of relief. And if you start extrapolating that out, and you start looking at how many intense and frequent natural disasters are going to occur, not just because of the geophysical limits of this planet, but because of climate change, we have to ask ourselves, can we honestly afford to continue this way? The answer is no. And so the question is, can we, as those of us who work for the taxpayers who produce a lot of that money internationally, but also for the taxpayers of Thailand, etc., can we come to some kind of common sense agreement about investing now in what's needed? And it's like life insurance. You never buy life insurance until you think you really need it, and by which time the premium is more expensive. But the innovation is coming from the private sector. People see that the tools that are needed, and so I am optimistic. But I think that in the development community, we're coming to a little too late. I hope not too little, to a realization that we have to invest in prevention and resilience, because we simply won't be able to afford to continue to invest in relief.
Deputy Prime Minister?
Well, I really fully agree with Madam Kyte and Madam Georgieva. Also, of course, when I gave a nod, it's because it seems that we discussed about what have happened, when did those events happen, and among experts it might not be too difficult to understand how we could have prevented them, and how we could handle it if it happens. But then it's interesting to understand of the why. Why certain countries decide to ignore the so-called majority poor, and then why certain countries decide to jump into it and be more responsive. And I don't know whether you look into this. My explanation is perhaps it's because of the politics. For countries with more higher degree of democracy, or countries with full democratic system, they tend to care more about the people, whether they wholeheartedly, genuinely care about those people, or whether they only want their votes, but form-wise, it means very much the same thing. So if you observe a situation around, which I did some of the homework, I found that those countries with higher degree of democracy, they tend to really understand what they should do to try to improve the well-beings of those millions of people, whether they're rich or they're poor. And this is important that I would like to add on the point that,
See,
our
that is
Paris
provocative
mentioned.
right there. So we could be super provocative, and I could say, for instance, which countries, but we won't do that. Because you all know. But that's really intriguing. Minister Cardenas, he strikes me as a very bold Minister of Finance and Public Credit. So this is a good question for you. This question sort of pops up in every conversation where money and priorities is a question. So somebody who's following the conversation says, how can we integrate disaster risk reduction in a post-2015 development goals, considering there are so many other priorities, for instance, education, and maybe health and maternal health and all sorts of very important issues. And then you've got potential natural disasters that haven't hit yet, but probably in Colombia's history, you know one's about to turn up.
It's a very good question. I think it's an excellent question. Because in answering that question, we have to think that extreme events or poverty reduction in a time of extremes does not mean that these are tail events. That these are not infrequent events, that extreme is part of the new normal, that these things can happen more often than you'd like to. So it's like being ready for something that can be quite extreme in its impact, but at the same time, quite likely. And so that makes you think, what is the best way to get prepared for that? You can think, well, let's have a fund or a mechanism, a vehicle that will allow us to cope with these extreme events. And that would take resources. Or let's use resources to prevent some of the impact and reduce the magnitude of the impact. And one thing that strikes me as particularly difficult is, since we're talking about countries that are poor and where the people that are affected by these events are likely to be poor, whatever you provide these groups of the population with tends to remain permanent. You can do that because of an extreme event or the manifestation of an event, but then it's very hard to take that out of the population. To say, well, we're no longer going to provide these subsidies. Let me give you an example, which is perhaps the best way I can illustrate this. Another type of extreme event, not a natural disaster, but a sharp recession. Think of a crisis. Then you introduce a program to help people cope with the crisis, like conditional cash transfers, which are meant to be just as a cushion for that extreme event, the recession, 20% unemployment rate. This is something we had in Colombia in the late 90s. And when we conceptualized that, we thought this is going to last while the country is in a recession. But here we are, nearly 14 years later, and the program has only grown. And of course, we have not been in a recession. We've been in a actually very good, healthy economy. So that makes you think that some of the things you do to cope with extreme events in countries that are poor, or where the population that is the target of these programs are poor, those programs, by the political nature and the political factors, tend to remain permanent. So you have to think that, yes, this takes resources, and takes resources in a rather permanent way. And there's, of course, the conflict with the development goals if you do not include this, or if these are not part of the development goals. But then that makes you think that since this is happening so frequently, it's part of the new normal, coping and preparing and readiness for extreme events should be part of the development goals.
Rachel.
Can I'd add to that?
Yes.
You know, if you think about the era of the current development goals, you know, one of the mainstream views in development is that one of the easiest ways to get to the poor, to get services to the poor, is when they're urbanised and to reach them where they live. Often in informal settlements around cities. Now we know that the rate of urbanisation is something that's unparalleled in our human history, and we know that that's going to increase. We've got 5,000 people moving into a city every month in the developing world at the moment, and over the next 20 years, so the period of the next development goals, this is going to intensify. If you look at the pattern of extreme weather events, and if you look at the pattern of disasters, especially in places like Southeast Asia where you've got coastal cities with huge populations growing, and in Africa, perhaps the most dangerous place to be if you are poor is in a city, because you're going to be an informal settlement, you're going to be in a slum on the side of a hill, and you're going to get battered again and again and again by storms or floods or whatever. And the cost of getting those services there, and the cost of prevention, of building those cities so that they can withstand this and so that they can provide livability, so that they can. I mean, I think these are the kinds of things, the past is no longer a predictor of the future, and we have to be able to deal with that in the new development goal scenario. So as we sort of lay this table of the new development goals, you have to imagine that natural disasters are simply the magician who comes up and pulls the tablecloth from underneath. And we have to hope that the cutlery and the crockery stays on the table.
And with that visual image, I am reluctantly letting the Minister for Finance for Colombia leave the stage. I know you have to go. Do you not have 15 more minutes for us?
His neighbours are waiting for us.
You have to go, seriously?
How can I resist that proposition?
Are you sure? Wow,
No.
That's great. I see a finger wagging. He wants to stay.
It's okay, it's okay.
That's all right. Ooh, I'm in trouble now. Okay, let's get back to the questions. This one's a good one. This is obviously somebody who's watching and he is engaged and wants to be more engaged. How can we close the gap between government and civil society to address disaster risk management? Kristalina?
What is happening is disasters are driving more and more to actually close this gap. The image that comes to my mind is Haiti after the earthquake. There has been an attempt from the government to build more capacity, civil protection capabilities. We are working on that. But the government also understands that their ability to act forcefully is very limited. So they're very keen to see communities and civil society organizations stepping up to the plate. And here is a very interesting invention. Somebody came and said, well, but if we map out our camps and urban areas on vulnerable, less vulnerable, and then we put a simple three-color flag system, green, everything is good, yellow, danger, red, those who are on low land, you have to evacuate. We will save many lives. So civil society comes up with a very interesting solution, and now the government is taking it and saying, well, we should be doing it everywhere. We should get this simple three-color, three-flag system. So I think we are no more in a place where the governments are reluctant to talk to civil society, because we are all in the same boat. I mean, to get into the visual, no more we can imagine civil society sitting on one side of the boat and the government on the other, and one side saying to the other, hey, your end of the boat is sinking. No more. But we should not take it for granted. We should, where the international community has a huge responsibility, catalog experiences, amplify them, spread them out, create the opportunities for these experiences to grow.
So as we've got Minister Cardenas here, I'm going to just get my time's worth out of you. So this next question, is interesting. Let me ask you first of all, when you were doing that catalogue of natural disasters that Colombia's experienced, did you get a lot of outside aid, traditional aid, to help recover?
During the event, you mean?
Yes, during the event.
During those events?
Yeah.
Oh, of course.
Right.
Of course.
Right.
For example, let me give you one case when I was also in government at the time, the earthquake of the city of Armenia, which is the coffee-producing region of Colombia. It was devastating. I was just saw in terms of the destruction. I was Minister of Transportation at the time, so I was involved with public works, and I was actually there right after the earthquake took place. And what amazed me the most is how rapid the response from many governments, and I'd like to mention here the United States and Japan, sending immediately the teams to rescue the people. That's amazing. I mean, that's when you see that with your own eyes, it's you feel so much gratitude to the people that do that. And I'm just mentioning 2 countries because, and there were many others. Then we worked very closely with the World Bank at that time to create not just the loans, but also the vehicle to deal with the damage. And I think it's set an example on what needs to be done in other parts because we created a special entity for the recovery and the reconstruction with a procurement procedure that was fast-tracked, more expedited, but with better governance structure of that agency. We involved a lot of people from the private sector, very prominent people in Colombia, and that was also a good example. I understand the World Bank. Jose Luis is here. I don't know if you remember that FOREC was an important example on how to deal with those issues. So I think there are many lessons that you learn, and from that episode, in my own experiences, you have to react very rapidly, and that's just not operational, but it's also on the fiscal side. You have to make sure that you can accommodate those additional expenditures without causing other damages. So the macro part and the fiscal part is very important. So you can deal with these things and you're ready. You don't have to start a discussion about new taxes, or you don't want to discuss that right at that time. You want to make sure that you have the capability of dealing with a crisis without compromising the macroeconomic equilibrium.
See, the reason I asked that question was because I really wanted to get a sense of how you dealt with those natural disasters, because this question says, can aid as we've seen it traditionally help bring about long-term investments in resilience? Minister from Thailand, Deputy Prime Minister, would you take that one on? So we hear where traditional aid actually has really helped a country like Colombia, but what about long-term investments? How does that happen?
Well, as I start the discussion, and of course, Madam Kyte picked it another time by saying that the cost of prevention is much, much lower than the cost of curing or handling, healing. And then, of course, when you have the so-called opportunity to invest for the long term, I would strongly recommend that we got to really jump on it, because it takes time to complete the so-called well-drafted master plan and construction. And these days, even Thailand is a bit luckier that the problem we suffer seems to be those storms and heavy rainfall. But these days, we need more capacity of both storage and drainage. Believe it or not, only about 2 months ago, that we in Thailand were worried that we might suffer with drought. We didn't seem to have enough water in those main reservoirs. And after a few days, then came few storms and filled those reservoirs and dams to almost the capacity. So it's important that we have to plan for the long term. And of course, if we really work on the well-disciplined physical position, when we plan for long term, it means that we don't really have to rush for very immediate, huge amount of investment too immediately. We can spare, of course, a certain investment budget for that. We can even plan and, of course, communicate well to the taxpayers if in case we need to, raise income a little bit, whether it's through the, consumption tax or whether it's through some other form of tax. So I think this is my recommendation.
I just want to remind you that the name of this session is Poverty Reduction in a Time of Extremes. I really enjoyed listening to all of the panelists, but I want to make sure that they didn't get off the stage without a thought where they were thinking, okay, I'm doing this session. What was it that I really wanted to get over? I don't want you to miss that opportunity. Minister Cardenas, what would you say? When you were invited to be in this session, what was it? This is my mission. I have to do this for the audience.
Really, I want to give a lot of credit to the World Bank. The World Bank has done a very good job. These lines, the CAT DDOs, I think are still in the very early stage. Is something that other countries should look at. It's the contingency plan. To be ready, to be prepared. So that's my main message.
Kristalina?
Well, I guess resilience is our newfound religion, here to stay. And joining you on credit to the World Bank. The fact that we are 5th time in a row on this topic is remarkable. We will see each other again and again and again and again. Since the first time, probably what I want to tell people is what has changed since we first met. What has changed is we now have very clear criteria to identify fragility. The bank contributed to that. We know how we can disaster-proof investments. Many of you have contributed to that. And we know how to bring financial instruments, financial innovations, the DDO you mentioned, but also the insurance industry, to create sound incentives long term. Where we, sorry I'm taking a bit long, but I want to come back to my main point. Where I think we are still in debt is this focus on the 20% most vulnerable that are 80% of the victims in the disasters.
Deputy Prime Minister, when you said yes to this session, what did you want to do in it?
Well, I think I would want to only leave a few words to you all. Of course, the session is titled as Shared Prosperity Through Resilience. I think I would want to add that shared resources for devastating possibilities. By saying this means that if we work with our friends in the region and we have some good understanding among our friends that if anything happened in any spot, we'll jump into that and help one another. And or some simple thing like share resource. For example, if something happened, we would need huge amount of workforces to jump into it. And in case of Thailand, during the flood in 2011, we have to get some good support from as many as 56,000 soldiers. And fortunately, they've been somewhat trained out of certain situation in the past. And those shared resources within the country, we've got to look at those well-trained, well-disciplined workforce to be knowledge enough to handle the situation. That's what I would like to leave for the group.
Rachel?
Well, I think a lot has happened since we started having these dialogues. We're on the cusp of beginning to take our Fund for the Poorest, IDA, and make it not only a fund for the poorest, but a fund that will invest in the resilience of the most vulnerable. And that's a huge attitudinal shift. And I think if we can show that development can understand and respond to resilience, I think we're on the right track. And then I think the other thing that I think it's one of the areas where we work really well together. You know, we can let the European Commission take the lead in the Horn of Africa. We can let the UN take the lead in Sahel. And, you know, there's no room for it. It's relatively egoless, the area of resilience. And I think that we're committed to continuing to work that way. And we wouldn't be here without Japan and without the lessons learned with our partners in Thailand and Colombia and elsewhere. The final thing I want to say is that, you know, it de-objectifies the poor. The poor are resilient. They have to be. And so it's not about handing out in that moment of strife when a disaster hits. Yes, there will always be that need for relief, and we work very closely with the humanitarian community, which Kristalina leads along with others. But it is simply that in that moment of crisis, the dignity is always there, will always be there. The methods for resilience are always there, and it's just about investing in that and then letting people build their lives again. And I think that that's a very important ethic for development as it is. And I think that there's something very honest about really understanding that in the role of resilience, development is simply to be there when you're needed. It's just that we don't need to be there needed just, you know, once every few, you know, what's happening to the world through climate change is that we are all needed all of the time. And as the minister said, you know, perhaps the most important thing you can do to help with resilience is to lobby for a carbon tax. You know, yes, write a cheque for Oxfam, write a cheque for Save the Children, write a cheque to a relief organisation and lobby for a carbon tax at the same time.
So I'm going to wrap up Resilience Dialogue number 5 with the best quotes, in my opinion, from each of the panellists. So you just heard Rachel Kyte. Rachel, I couldn't write this down quick enough, but it was an image about crockery on the table, and it. Can you do a little review of that? Just do it for us again, because that was great. What was that?
Well, you know, there's that old sort of music hall in the Victorian English tradition, right? Of you lay a dining table with, you know, the silverware and the crockery and the cutlery and the glassware, and then you try to pull the tablecloth out and leave everything standing. Well, you know, 9 times out of 10 you can't do it. Something gets broken, right? And you know, and I think we're gambling a little bit with development unless we invest in disaster resilience, because the disasters are pulling that tablecloth from underneath the crockery.
That image was brought to you by Vice President for Sustainable Development of the World Bank.
I will come to your house and attend the trip anytime you want.
Thank you, but no thank you. Minister Kittirat is the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance in Thailand. What really resonated with me was that it takes time to complete a master plan. I like that. I love that. Okay, and then we move on to Dr. Kristalina Georgieva. She is the European Commission for Humanitarian Aid. And again, I need some help here with your imagery. It was about the end of your boat is sinking. Do a recap, a quick recap there.
We could mime it for you.
Yes, just the phrase again so that people can go away with that visual.
Well, the phrase is, you know, we have 2 constituencies, civil society and government, in a disaster world, and one says to the other, hey, your end of the boat is sinking.
I shouldn't have favourites, but I don't care. I have a favourite. Because not only did he ignore his... Remember a staff over there who told him to leave 20 minutes earlier? I love that. He is bold. He is a bold Minister of Finance and Public Credit for Colombia. This is the quote, the winning one as far as I'm concerned. Extreme is the new normal. How better to end this session with that quote. Thank you, panellists. Thank you for being a great audience. Thank you.